On December 20th, 1860, a group of South Carolina secessionists set off a chain of events that ultimately resulted in the deaths of 620,000 American soldiers during 4 years of bloody Civil War. This presentation outlines the cause of the war from source documents of the men who lived during that time and made the decisions which led to the conflict. The unique aspect of this presentation is utilizing the truth of God's Word to shed light on the reason why the war was fought and God's purpose for America by allowing the war. At the beginning of 1862, 2 strategic victories for the North occurred in the Western Theater. God chose to elevate an unknown Union general by the name of Ulysses S Grant from obscurity to fame through the battles of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. The forts were held by Confederate troops before succumbing to Federal forces. The Confederate general who ended up in charge of Fort Donelson was Simon B. Buckner, a friend of General Grant's before the war. When he saw there was no alternative but to surrender, he sent a request to Grant asking the terms of surrender. Grant's reply was,
"No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works."
Buckner bitterly accepted these terms and surrendered the fort. Only a year earlier, Grant had been working as a clerk in his brother's leather goods store. This victory would begin his meteoric rise in rank and prestige during the Civil War. The North elevated Grant's reputation to that of a hero. From this battle, Grant obtained a nickname that his initials, U.S., stood for unconditional surrender. After the Northern victories at Forts Henry and Donelson, the next major battle in the Western Theater was April 6th and 7th at Shiloh, Tennessee. Shiloh was a small country church, and the Hebrew word for Shiloh means place of peace. The Battle of Shiloh turned out to be a place of terror and bloodshed. Shiloh became the bloodiest battle of the war up to that time, with almost 24,000 casualties. The number of casualties compared to the total soldiers engaged in the battle was an astounding 26%. This hard-fought Union victory caused each side to realize that the war would be long and costly. A major battle in the Western Theater was fought at the end of 1862 and extended into the beginning of 1863 near Murfreesboro, Tennessee. The Battle of Murfreesboro in the South was also known as the Battle of Stones River in the North. Federal forces totaled 43,000. The Confederates fought with 38,000 men. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War with almost 24,000 casualties, an astounding 30% of the troops engaged in battle. The Federal Army won the battle with the Confederates retreating to Chattanooga, Tennessee. In the Eastern Theater, Federal General George McClellan was a skilled organizer and spent the springtime drilling and building the morale of the Army of the Potomac. General McClellan began to move the 150,000-man Army of the Potomac against the Confederates in March 1862. He decided to take a circuitous route to Richmond by moving the army around the Virginia Peninsula, utilizing a fleet of 400 ships and boats. The Army of the Potomac plodded along from Yorktown to within 10 miles of the capital of the Confederacy by the end of May. The Battle of Seven Pines took place from May 31st to June 1st, 1862. An event took place in this battle that forever would change the events of the war. Confederate General Joseph Johnston was severely wounded in the battle and was replaced by the military advisor to Jefferson Davis. This military advisor was none other than General Robert E. Lee. McClellan was a cautious commander, but Lee showed aggressiveness on the battlefield. These traits would be soon apparent at the next major battle in the Eastern Theater between these generals. The 7 Days Battle, which was really a series of battles, lasted 7 consecutive days, from June 25th to July 1st, 1862. Federal forces consisted of 105,000 strong versus Confederate forces totaling 85,000. The casualties in this series of battles were 36,000 soldiers. Though McClellan had the numerical advantage and won 4 of the 6 battles outright, he decided to retreat 6 times instead of capturing Richmond. The Army of the Potomac was within sight of the Confederate capital, but the aggressive fighting of General Lee's troops and the cautious maneuvering of General McClellan saved Richmond. During the 7 days battle, the Lincoln administration decided to form a new army from federal troops in the Washington and Shenandoah Valley areas. The goal of this army was to strike and defeat the Confederates. The Army of Virginia, as this force was named, would be led by Union General John Pope. After experiencing success in the Western Theater, General Pope was given the opportunity to lead this new army. Pope and his army would suffer a crushing defeat on August 29th to 30th, 1862, at the hands of General Lee and General Jackson. This battle was called Second Bull Run in the North and Second Manassas in the South. The Federal Army totaled 63,000 soldiers, with 54,000 men in the Confederate Army. Total casualties were 24,000, or 21% of all the soldiers in the conflict. After this victory, General Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia began to prepare for an invasion of the North. This decision would have far-reaching consequences for the remainder of the war. General Lee and the Confederate Army began the invasion into Maryland in September 1862. An amazing piece of intelligence fell into General McClellan's hands shortly after the Confederates entered Maryland. A copy of Lee's Special Orders No. 191 was found in an abandoned Confederate campsite wrapped around 3 cigars. This order gave McClellan the positions of Lee's entire army. A jubilant McClellan exclaimed,
"Here is a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home."
Unfortunately, the Federal Army of the Potomac did not take advantage of this opportunity. On September 17, 1862, the Battle of Antietam, or the Battle of Sharpsburg in the South, became the bloodiest day in American history. General Joseph Hooker wrote after the battle,
"Every stalk of corn in the field was cut as closely as could have been done with a knife, and the slain lay in rows, precisely as they had stood in their ranks a few moments before."
The Confederate Army withdrew from the battlefield, thus giving the Federal Army a tactical victory. The carnage and bloodshed were horrific. In 1 day of fighting, there were over 23,000 casualties, over 12,000 for the North and over 11,000 for the South. Of the total Confederate force of 45,000, their casualties were 24% of their army. The Union Army totaled 87,000 men, with a casualty rate of 14%. The total combined dead were over 3,600 soldiers. The battle was summed up by a Federal captain who stated,
"I have heard of the dead lying in heaps, but never saw it till at this battle. Whole ranks fell together."
This Federal victory was the key to the unfolding of Lincoln's plan. He called together his cabinet on September 22, 1862. Lincoln explained,
"When the rebel army was in Frederick, I determined, as soon as it should be driven out of Maryland, to issue a proclamation of emancipation, such as I thought most likely to be useful. I said nothing to anyone, but I made the promise to myself and to my Maker. The rebel army is now driven out, and I am going to fulfill that promise."
Lincoln acknowledged that he looked to God in his decision-making pertaining to this war-changing declaration. The proclamation was made public 2 days after the cabinet meeting. The reason for the war changed in the North. God was performing his purpose in America to deliver the country from the evil of slavery. After the Battle of Antietam, General McClellan failed to pursue the retreating Confederate army. President Lincoln became exasperated. He responded to a request for fresh horses from General McClellan by saying,
"Will you pardon me from asking what the horses of your army have done since the Battle of Antietam that fatigues anything?"
Lincoln replaced General McClellan with General Ambrose Burnside in November 1862. General Burnside reluctantly accepted the promotion and was put in an awkward position. He was personal friends with General McClellan and worked with him in civilian life before the war. Burnside knew his own weaknesses and shortcomings. A fellow officer wrote that,
"Burnside wept like a child. and is the most distressed man in the Army, openly saying he's not fit for the job.
Unfortunately, General Burnside's time as commander of the Army of the Potomac would be short-lived. On December 13, 1862, the Battle of Fredericksburg was fought between 116,000 Federals and 78,000 Confederates, approximately midway between Richmond and Washington. Total combined casualties were over 18,000, with the Union suffering over 12,000 of this total. Confederate troops were well fortified behind a stone wall, and their artillery commanded the battlefield. General Burnside ordered wave after wave of frontal assaults, and the Federal Army was decimated by the Confederates. Over 8,000 Federal soldiers fell during these assaults, and some never even reached to the stone wall. During this slaughter of the Federals, General Lee commented to a fellow officer,
"It is well that war is so terrible. We should grow too fond of it."
The Union Army suffered a terrible defeat, and Burnside lost the confidence of his men. In January of 1863, General Burnside was relieved of command of the Army of the Potomac. Though the year ended with tragic defeat at Fredericksburg, Virginia, the reason for the war had changed in the North. Slavery was about to be dealt a blow on January 1st, 1863. Before moving on to 1863, consider the comment by General Grant.
As soon as slavery fired upon the flag, it was felt. We all felt, even those who did not object to slaves, that slavery must be destroyed. We felt that it was a stain to the Union that men should be bought and sold like cattle.